All right, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Elder Law section of the Florida Bar, welcome. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for joining us today for a great discussion on exploitation. To the attorneys who are here, we hope you can learn how to better protect your clients. And to the members of the public, we hope you can learn some valuable tools to protect yourselves and your loved ones. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Attorney Shannon Miller with the Elder Law section to introduce our panelists and get the conversation going.
Thank you, Hannah. Hi, I'm Shannon Miller. And I want to talk today, we're going to talk with some really good attorneys and law enforcement officer, Sergeant Lewis, about really what's happening out in the state of Florida with regard to exploitation. And, you know, are we getting good criminal prosecutions? What are the struggles? What are some of the accomplishments? What are some things that are going well? Maybe what are some things that we maybe need a little more work on? And we're very fortunate today that we are joined by Assistant State Attorney Anthony Gill, State Attorney Catherine Rundle from Miami. We also have Sergeant Heath Lewis from Lee County. He's going to talk to us a little bit about what he's seeing out there. And hopefully what we're going to have a little bit of time to do today is really to update you all on what we're seeing out there. Maybe we have a little time at the end to answer some questions, so feel free to put those in the chat. And let's get started. I am going to start off with State Attorney Rundle. And what I'd like to ask you is really just give us some idea of what you do in your daily life. I know you're joining us from your vacation. So thank you for taking the time to do that. It's that important to you. I know you've had some really good success with some of your criminal exploitation prosecutions. We've heard a lot about that, and we really love that. We want to encourage that. So tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're seeing and what you're excited about out there in Miami.
Well, first of all, thank you, Shannon, very much. And I want to congratulate the Florida Bar, our bar, right, for hosting this very important topic with the section, Elderly Affairs section. And I want to thank all the panelists. I can't really see them, but it's okay. I know they're there. And I want to thank them for what they do every day, especially in this field. And as we get started, I want to give a real shout out to Anthony Gill, Tony Gill, that you introduced, Shannon, a few minutes ago. He's just such a superstar. And it's not easy to find prosecutors that want to develop the expertise that's necessary for these kinds of cases, elderly exploitation cases in particular. And I'm just so happy that he moved back to Miami, his hometown, and he's working with me on this. So to all my colleagues and the other panelists and Shannon and those that are listening, I don't think it's any secret that we know the fastest growing population in Florida is what we might call the elderly, 65 years and older. That's how I define it, which most of the law does. And in Miami-Dade County, we're about 3 million residents, and almost 18 to 20% of that population are defined by law as the elderly population. And sometimes when you look at some of the national data, because I started to familiarize myself with this, you can see that Florida has a very high dollar amount and a high victimization volume of people. And so that was just sort of the backdrop that helped me understand the magnitude of this. And then what we were seeing in the office, in our community, were a combination of different ways in which vulnerable adults and the elderly were being exploited or maltreated or abused or neglected, not understood, and so on and so forth. So what I did was we found some autism issues. A young man was killed, and we charged the caretakers with manslaughter. But the point was that while we watched the circuit closed TV, we could see that they did not have the training. It was 4 people. They held him down. They choked him to death. And that's why it's a manslaughter, but it just started to say, wait, there's something wrong with this. If we don't understand, he couldn't do anything. He was helpless and very vulnerable. At around the same time, it's always elderly fraud, mortgage fraud, financial exploitation, ID theft of the elderly. Those have always been sort of constants. But what we started to see around the same time was this increase for the elderly that own property. So we start a lot, as you know, I can tell by the affirmative nods, a lot of our folks work their whole lives. They own their homes outright. So there's no mortgage, there's no company you got to notify if you're going to take over. And the more we got into it, we started to realize that this was a real problem. The other thing is oftentimes they have savings accounts, right? You hope they worked all their lives to save their money. And so I'll give you just one example, which really made us realize we had to go into action fast and aggressively. And I'm going to give you the example of Julio Mendez. He was 90 years old. He had owned his own home, his own car. He had about $300,000 in a savings account, paid his all bills, and he was living really well until COVID hit. He got very sick with COVID, and I guess age or whatever underlying issues he had. He ended up in the hospital for quite some time. And then he went into a facility, a rehab facility for about a month. When they went to him at the end of that month, they said, you need to pay us. He said, no problem. For you to stay here, you need to pay us. I got the money. But you know what he discovered? He didn't have the money. He was homeless. He was penniless. He was carless. He was voiceless. And so when we analyzed, and the defrauder was a relative. So the other thing, so we were able to help Mr. Mendez through our collaboration in Miami-Dade. We got some great victims advocates, and I'll talk about that a little later, Shannon. I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but you really need all of the various services it can't just be an arrest. It's got to be almost immediate intervention and connectors to various services and shelters and whatever they may need, right? In this case, we were able to raise money and he was okay. I've met him personally. He was healthy, but it would really he was still homeless and penniless, but we got him shelter. Let me put it that way. And he was very grateful. But what we learned, and then they took off to Spain. It was the niece and her son. And we spent years, we found them, we extradited them, we brought them back. But the point is but we got him back, but he didn't get his home back. Right. Yeah. So, and that brings up a couple issues. So a couple of things that we're finding, and maybe some of the private practitioners and the deputy sheriff is as well. About over 60% of this financial exploitation is done by relatives or trustworthy people. Like, a daughter brings in a caretaker to take care of somebody. Maybe they live out of state. But it's really someone they know. And they build, that elderly person or disabled person builds a trust in them. And then that brings us to like all these power of attorneys. Power of attorneys, you won't believe the things we see. We have a case where a woman, a daughter, whose mother was in the hospital, walks into the hospital, goes up to, actually, I don't think she was legitimately the daughter. I'm sorry. She said she was the daughter. She gets into the room. She tells all the nurses, anybody to leave, said, I'm the daughter and this is my attorney, and gets her mother to sign everything over to her. And then she leaves. And of course, the mother had no idea, which brings up another issue, which is a lot of the relatives moms don't want to tell on their son. Moms don't want to tell on their daughter, their niece. For a start, they think that's all they have in life. There's some shame factor. There shouldn't be, right? They were thieves, but they don't necessarily want to spend this part of their life prosecuting someone they spent a whole life loving and trusting. Caretakers, doctors. We had a man who became a widow. His wife died. He goes into a funeral home to make arrangements. And of course, the woman that's working there at the funeral home spots his vulnerabilities immediately. And she just moves in on him into his house, into his property, into his bank accounts. You know, we've seen that we had two men who were married to each other, lived a beautiful life, had a house worth $1 million point something in Coconut Grove. They worked all their lives. One of them got very sick. The husband would take his husband to the clinic, and of course, the lady in the clinic spotted exactly their vulnerabilities. She moved in, got a power of attorney, and stole their house. And of course, as you know, once they take the house and sell it, it's impossible to recapture it. So those are just some examples that really led us to form what we call EVA. And EVA stands for Elderly and Vulnerable Adults. And it's a model that I've used for human trafficking and others that I think works really well. And what I mean by that is you need everybody. You need everyone in law enforcement. So we have a task force of different officers, because that's the other thing. A lot of police, God love them for what they do, they think it's civil, right? I don't know, I signed this thing and they took my house. Oh no, that's civil.
Right.
And it just takes a certain expertise. So that's why you need a specialized task force. So we did that. We also got together with all the licensing agencies, you know, all the home health care managers, ARC. We need, our legal services, the private sector has been amazing. So we connect up with legal services and legal aid to help us, because we don't really know that civil side of it as well. And usually they need immediate intervention. If you're going to save somebody's house, you need to run to court right away and say, look, we think this is a fraud. Could you please put a pause or list pendants or whatever? So we've done that. In the time that we've had this organized, I want to say, I don't have those numbers with me, I'm sorry, but my last recall was we had almost 100 of criminal cases. That doesn't account for the civil cases and victims. We work with DCF, of course, Elderly Affairs, of course. We formed a task force with all agencies. Our mayor, Levine, which is the larger municipality in Miami-Dade County, is a partner with us. We had Rene Garcia, who's a commissioner, but a former senator. And I invited him because he used to be on the Health and Human Services Committee. So he understands, he's been doing this for a long, long time. And then I'm just going to close with this thought, so that I'm sure you want to open it up. And I apologize to my panelists. At least this way I got it out in case I lose connection over here in California. But, you know, we really were blessed to have a lot of assistance from everybody who cares about the elderly. And it was just a matter of organizing it, collaborating, getting it done. And so far, God willing, we're going to keep moving forward. And I'm so happy to see our colleagues in the Florida Bar wanting to focus on this. So thank you again very much.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I'm not sure if you're aware, State Attorney Rundle, but we do actually have a panel that the Elder Law section put together of civil practitioners who's available to answer questions related to issues like, how do you interpret this trust? Or what does this durable power of attorney mean? And we actually have a statewide panel that we established to create a resource without any cost to law enforcement officers, prosecutors, if they need that civil insight with regard to like we had a case in Gainesville that involved a very complicated trust that had some gifting provisions in it. And we were able to sit down with law enforcement and explain why those gifting didn't apply in that case. So, you know, we have these resources. What we probably need to do is connect the civil side
yes.
with the criminal side so that we can help you guys do more of these criminal prosecutions, because it's very exciting to hear about this collaboration that you're working out in Miami. So thank you so much for your service on that. We really appreciate that.
We'll be calling. We'll be calling.
Yeah, we're around. So let's move on to Sergeant Lewis. I know you're in Lee County. I know there was a lot of fraud and scams surrounding the hurricane in 2022, and I'm sure that you are in the trenches. I see you shaking your head to some of the things Rundle is saying. Tell us, like, what do you do there? What are you seeing? What are some of the new things that are happening there for you?
So in economic crimes here in Lee County, we deal with everything from exploitation to construction fraud to, unlicensed contractors, during the state of emergency, making it a felony. We're seeing all kinds of different things. We were talking about grandparent scams, earlier, and these grandparent scams, we see that's the highest dollar amount. We see those, and they're just money just goes so fast. And going through wire transfers, and if we were talking about the legislation you were proposing and whatnot, it was just these are just a lot of different things that these detectives here in Lee County Sheriff's Office specialize in, and it's very difficult. And like the state attorney said, it's hard because most deputies and officers don't understand these things. But we specialize it. I was reading some of the questions on there about how do local law enforcement members. Most areas have a economic crime section or a financial fraud, and they can report it to us. And they can ask for that specific unit and ask for a supervisor and contact us. We all have phone numbers, and we all try to help as much as we can. With Hurricane Ian, the contractor fraud right now is just it's skyrocketing, and we're combating it with our state attorney's office, here in the 20th Judicial Circuit, and we work hand in hand with the state attorneys. I mean, we call them, if not once a day, 5 times a day. So we deal with that all the time on specialized cases, exploitation cases. We have a specific attorney that we deal with all the time, and it helps us build a better case and successful prosecutions all the time.
Do you run into issues where, so we have this exploitation injunction statute, 825.1035, and it really is, the elder law section passed that legislation and created, it's the first in the nation where you can actually freeze assets, and most of the asset freezes when we file those petitions is done within 24 hours. So, there's kind of a disconnect. I've seen it, I know, where law enforcement's kind of doing these criminal prosecutions, but we also have these civil tools. And I sometimes feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between, law enforcement knowing that we can actually freeze these assets very effectively in the civil side. I know with where I am in Gainesville, we work together with the state attorney, and, he's like, go get the asset freeze. And we're like, go execute the search warrant, so like they're doing their criminal stuff, and we're making sure that no more money goes out from the banks. And I'm just wondering, is that something that we see statewide? Is there anything that you see where we might be more of a resource to you in some fashion, where we could help get these cases and stop the assets from going out? Like I hear State Attorney Rundle talking about, their house is gone. Like, yes, there are things that we can do from the civil side to prevent that from happening. And I just wonder if you had any suggestions or ideas about collaborating better so that we can really work together more to really stop these assets from going out the door.
I think, the problem is when it's such a lag behind of when they found out they're exploited, of when they get exploited, and then they figure it out, and the money and or assets are gone at that point in time. And it sometimes it's a month. We've had 5 to 7 years for a case that we're trying to investigate. And that comes into a big issue. We try to do immediate search warrants if we can find the assets or any of the other issues. We really do try. We have saved some houses, and we have saved some accounts and frozen. Robinhood, we did one for a search warrant on Robinhood recently and saved $10,000. And we were able to seize that money and return it back to the victim, which was great work by our team here. And it's just, but we have to move fast, or the bad guy has to be slow. And if it moves too fast, if it we were talking about, grandparent scams that originate outside the United States, that money is outside of our jurisdiction. And then any bank or program that's outside that doesn't recognize the state of Florida or the United States government, it hurts us trying to get this money. Federal legislation would help with that, I believe, too, if we could slow down any, wire transfers. I know that's a bigger aspect, but the 24 hours, with a wire transfer is hard. It's very difficult.
Right. But, sometimes, and I share this because I just had a case like this where the fraud is being investigated internally by the bank, and they'll slow the transaction for a certain time period, right? So they know this transaction is fraudulent, they have a certain timeline internally where they can slow it down. And so sometimes if we can intervene with that exploitation injunction and we get the state court to issue a court order that temporarily freezes that account, so it says, look, that money is not going out until we have a final hearing on this thing, that may help us with this issue. I think part of the problem is, yeah, State Attorney Rendell, I think part of the problem is we do have these tools. It's just like one silo isn't talking to the other. And so maybe what we need to do is even more collaboration from the civil and the criminal side. State Attorney Rendell, I know you had something to share here.
Yes, no, because I want to weigh in on that just a little bit. And Tony may actually know better because he deals with this every day. But I do feel that, from where I am, right, which we need to do better collaboration on that. I mean, right now, the way it works, we have a victims advocate and Tony and the task force. We have 4 detectives that just work under Tony, in our office. And then we have a good relationship with our probate court, which is where we tend to go and say, wait, quick. But, this could really now, Tony, are we utilizing that?
We're not utilizing that as much as we should, but it's not really that. I don't think that's the biggest problem because from my perspective, as much as we try to collaborate with the civil side, and if there's a civil attorney attached to something, the biggest problem I'm seeing right now is in the last, say, like dozen cases that I'm looking at, the reporting happens so far out from the actual act that the money's either gone or the property gone or there's no asset left. I was just consulting on a case this morning where we have a guardian who's stealing from someone who this is a woman who wormed her way into somebody else's life and became a guardian. Either still don't know if it's fraudulent. We don't know if it was true or not because it was many years ago. But what we're seeing is that the money's gone, right? The money's been withdrawn or it's been spent. Perhaps there's money sitting in the potential subject's bank account, but that's not as easy of a get as if you could just get it stopped. So, one of the stats that I looked at is that only about 1 in 44 elder financial abuse cases are reported nationwide. So think about that number, right? That's like it's about 2% are reported nationwide. And of that 2%, if you just think about just law of averages, you've got the time from the financial crime happening to the time that we find out about it is so long that the money's gone. So while I 100% agree that collaboration would be very useful, I think it's only truly effective in those cases where we can make an early intervention.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll tell you, so just so you guys know what we do on the civil side, we will get the case in, we see that it's exploitation, we run to the courthouse, we have to make a report with Adult Protective Services if one hasn't already. So we call the elder abuse hotline. That's required before we can even file our petition with the court. Then what happens is we have this emergency order where the judge freezes everything. Then it has to be within 15 days. Usually it's within 7 days that we have a final hearing and we bring in the exploiter. And you guys will love this. Every single exploitation injunction hearing is recorded. Every single one of us in the elder law section has been trained that you have the exploiter waive their right to remain silent because they're all going to say it was a gift. And so then we have literally, we wrap up all the evidence. We have an admission, usually a confession on the record of them having exploited our victim. And a lot of times what happens is, and I know this isn't true necessarily in my jurisdiction, but we will hand deliver it over to the state attorney's office. And then it's like, it's like radio silence. They're like, we got murders. We've got somebody who just got beaten to death in the back of a car. And, you're handling it. It's hard. So I hear you.
I want to put it out there right now, and I'm sure State Attorney Rendell would agree with me. If you want to hand deliver me a package like that, I will gladly take it. I will gladly take it because I know that our office is very interested in any evidence of elder exploitation.
That's beautiful, and I think that's really part of our reason for even having this today is because I think you guys are doing great work. I know from when I started just looking at how we could make the criminal exploitation statute better. And we started working with state attorneys across the state to help figure out, like, we got rid of this requirement that you have to show, that this was some sort of scheme to defraud. We had all these things that were in the statute that we eliminated. It got better and better. But I think part of the problem is that we're just not sharing enough information with each other. I think we all have the same goal to protect vulnerable adults. And I think if we can work together, I think it will be so much better. But Tony, tell us a little bit about you. Like, I looked Tony up, right? So I'm trying to figure a background of all you people, and I looked Tony up, and he has an LLM in civil trial practice.
That's an interesting story. When I was an early career prosecutor way back when, in the early 2000s, I saw an advertisement for it. I thought it'd be really helpful because one day I wanted to go out and make all this money, not in government service. Well, here I am in government service, but I went and got it. It was a really interesting program. I've no regrets in getting it because it made me a better lawyer. But about me, I mean, I have a pretty simple story. I'm born and raised here in Miami, Florida. I went to law school up in Pennsylvania and met someone, bought a house, had a career, unmet someone, sold the house, looked around and said, what am I still doing here? So I came home and I joined this office. It's been probably the best 9 months of my life coming back. But in Pennsylvania, I focused on financial crime cases. I'm also a certified fraud examiner. I was part of a very small group of people that wrote the initial funding request for the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office for an elder and vulnerable adult unit. It was called something different there. It was called the Elder Justice Unit, but it's semantics. It was the same thing. We dealt with financial exploitation. I focused more on real estate transactions at the time and fraudulent transactions, but that's me in a nutshell. I've been at this for I think I'm going to my 18th year.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of the things that you're seeing out there, like it's egregious, right? And
well, and by the way, I noticed that State Attorney Rundle wanted to weigh in there. I saw, but I think she's muted.
You're muted.
A lot of people would like to mute me. No, I think I did it to myself. No, I just wanted to emphasize and underscore. You can see why we really wanted to move him down here and move him in. And he's just taken this bull by the horn. So I'm really, really proud of what we are doing. I do think that, it's like everything. There isn't going to be one thing that's going to solve everything.
No.
But there's going to be a category of cases where we do see at the front end. And so we can engage with the Florida bar on those kinds of cases. There'll be some, like Tony and the sheriff said, they're so old, which is another thing we need to work on, right? The reporting system. I mean, I don't want to go back too much in historical, but that was one of the things we spotted around the same time as the exploitation was on the rise, is these reports were being made, a neighbor, a relative, a caretaker, a nurse, a doctor, and nothing was happening. We weren't getting those reports. So one of the purposes of, building this association, this task force, was to make sure all those pieces were shored up and that we followed those reports and followed where they went and what were the consequences, what were the results, who was doing what, that type of thing. So I'm really excited about what you're telling the practitioners about. It's a big deal.
I love that. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
And if I can weigh in, State Attorney, there's a case that we are actively prosecuting in which the attorneys brought it to us. And I don't think it's anyone in this section or anyone on this presentation, but there was a case of a guardian who had to intervene because a handyman from the neighborhood, once again, I use the words, wormed his way into this lady's life. And what they did was they took him to guardianship court and tried to file an injunction against him being at the property. And during this injunction, he makes a bunch of great statements that help us. There's no state action, so we're not directing any kind of we're not directing the investigation at that point. But there are a number of statements. In fact, I have them on my wall right here because I'm
I
one of these
love
people
that.
that writes on the, well, not on the wall. I write on a board on the wall. So stuff like he makes an admission about about having a joint bank account. He makes an admission about transferring to from the joint account to one that he opens into himself. He makes an admission that an account was opened. All these are very helpful for our case, right? Because now we have his stories locked down, because when he's arrested, guess what he told the police? That much.
Yep. Yeah, and we can do this for you. I can't tell you how many cases I have had in exploitation injunction court where they think that if they put money in the joint account and then they use it for themselves, that it's a defense.
Nope.
And I mean, I know, and I love it. And they've had the right to remain silent. Like, the judge has given the instruction. I then give the instruction as well before I examine them. I mean, we have this stuff. I think we're all on the same team. I think we need to start working better together to work together. But let me move on, because I know we have so much information to provide to people out there, and there's a bunch of questions that have come in. But before I do move to the questions, can you guys give just a quick overview to our public people who are on this webinar? Tell them, what can they do to better protect themselves from becoming a victim in one of these cases?
Tony, give them the checklist.
All right. So I think that there are a number of things I looked at, and the state attorney also looked at. And first is, if you're a practitioner, I would advise your clients to make a plan for later in life. And that's sorely missing from even people who are very educated. My own mother has a doctorate. She worked in this Miami-Dade school district for the Miami-Dade School District for 39 years, retired, right? She's a very educated person. I asked her the other day, as I'm going through thinking about my own cases, I said, well, do you have a will? Do you have a living will? Have you appointed a guardian? And it was question marks from her, right? And this is something that I think that practitioners can do when they have clients. Now, something that we see a lot in our own investigations is we have well-meaning attorneys who draft wills, who draft sensitive documents for clients. And many times the bad actor will come in posing as the son, the grandson, or other relative, with someone who may not necessarily have the capacity to understand what they're doing anymore. So while it's not the practitioner's job to sit there and give a prospective client the 5th degree or the 10th degree or the 20th degree, but it would be helpful if practitioners could just inquire a little bit, and just, if they see something, say something. On the practitioner side, I would think that if there is a crime being committed, the crime fraud exception could potentially shield the practitioner from reporting it. But obviously, I wouldn't want any practitioner or anybody with an Esquire behind their name to report or do anything that would be unethical. But anything within ethical bounds to report what they see would help. Now, for someone who's not a practitioner, it's pretty easy. I mean, just, you need to stay vigilant. Some of the things that we see are text scams and Facebook scams. And if you get the text saying, this is the IRS, well, number one, don't reply, right? Number two, if someone calls you, don't, and they purport to be a government agency or something like that, tell them you'll call them back, and then search for the number. That's a lot of times that's what we see. In fact, I had a case back in Pennsylvania where an individual was contacted by a quote unquote sheriff who was collecting money. And the sheriff told him that he needed to meet him at X place at X time. Luckily, this guy called the police, and the police called us, and we were able to intervene right then and there. We met the purported sheriff, who was wearing a fake sheriff hat, fake sheriff badge, and he was arrested. And this was many years ago in a suburb of Philadelphia where I was a prosecutor at the time. But those are the little things. Like if it kind of smells like something, then question it. One of the tactics that I give, and I use my mom as an example because she's very educated, but she receives a text message from FPL, and she says, "This is FPL. This is your bill." Starts panicking. I don't have a bill. I said, "Well, why don't you Google FPL's number and call the number that you found online?" She did it. She found she didn't have a bill. So those are the real simple things. The other simple things are just identity related. You want to make sure you're not giving your identity out, such as driver's license, social security number, or any other sensitive information for anyone who calls you or anyone who solicits you. Ultimately, I think that some of this stuff, just the common sense stuff, is the stuff that people should be doing. Now, for those individuals who are especially vulnerable, it gets a little harder, right? Because you have say an individual who has capacity to make their own decisions, but is a little older, might be afraid of consequences if they don't pay the IRS bill. Well, for those individuals, if you are a family member, if you are friends with someone like that, whether they have capacity or they've been declared incapacitated for some reason by the courts, check on them, right? I think having a social net is one of the best protectors for individuals who are vulnerable, because vulnerability happens when you have no one around you who's paying attention. And I want to say that the last 4 cases, it's 4 days in a row I've consulted on something, and the last 4 cases, 4 complaints that have come into our own EVA unit here, our detectives deal with someone who outside the family who came in and I keep using the word worm, so it's hard to find a synonym for that, but someone who wormed themselves into someone's life, and that's because family was out of state, family was out of town. So if you're a family member, if you are, or anyone a neighbor, we've had neighbors who phoned in and said, "Hey, we haven't seen this person in a while," right? So if you're family, neighbor, friend, stay in touch with people who might be vulnerable, because that's their safety net.
Sergeant Lewis, anything to add? I know like the situation with, fraudulent contractors and really taking advantage of some of the terrible weather related issues that come through our beautiful state. Anything else? I know you were talking a lot about these grandparent schemes and how horrible those are.
Yeah, and we're seeing those, and the best thing, like Attorney Gill said, the family involvement is key. It really is key. The neighbors, the family area, neighbors we've had reports from neighbors, and we've had successful prosecution with exploitation from that as well. The grandparent schemes, we're seeing a lot of Uber drivers or Lyft drivers picking up packages, this, that, and the other, and the money's going, and by the time we're trying to figure it out, we're trying to, run license plate readers, or we're trying to do anything with Accurant, or, David or Elvis, and we're trying to use all our sources, trying to track down a possible mule, as we like to call them, and we're trying to track them down and find out where that money and end goal is very difficult. And again, we're usually a day late, dollar short on a lot of those because it's happening so fast. But I have to agree with, keeping the family involved in wills and trusts. As you said, they are the first line defense to protecting the elderly. My father's a retired law enforcement officer, and I keep on harping on him about getting a trust and making sure that they're, being taken care of. And it's hard. And we put on classes, twice a year through our sheriff's office it's called the Citizens Academy, that we have elderly citizens come in. I actually teach a part. We just had it last night. And we teach a part on how to keep yourself safe from economic crimes, from, checking your credit score, trying to do all these things, checking your accounts, having, minimum deposits on there and minimum withdrawals, so you can get alerted on these things, anything even from mail, so you can see where your mail's coming in. So we try to help these people out as much as we can. It's just very difficult. And, but, everything we get from it gets a lot of
I just want to add a couple of things that we've learned in the civil world. Number one is a lot of people don't realize that their information is sold on the dark web. And guess what, everyone? It is. So the more that you talk, the longer you stay on the phone, the more likely they'll find out what your currency is, what you attach to, and then they'll create a scam to target you. And also, yeah, go ahead.
They're doing data mining too through Facebook and social media on these elderly people, because a lot of the elderly people don't lock their social media and Facebook accounts. So they
Right.
data mine that information, and we've seen it where they customize the scam for these victims to take the money away from them especially the grandparent scams. You know, they show a picture of, oh, here's my granddaughter, you know, her name is, you know, Janie, and then they you know, facilitate that scam with that name, and it makes it
That's insane. I mean, and that's what's happening out there, is that this organized crime, you know, we actually have a network of organized criminals that are way more advanced than we can be in defending against these things. And so things like that, where you actually have the name of the grandchild, you know, their age, like it's crazy. They're going to create that scam. And I think that you add to that the vulnerability that comes with aging. And what we know about the exploitable brain is it's the 10 years before there's incapacity. So, you know, we might have people who can't determine residence, make medical decisions, financial decisions. That's year 10 to 20. Year 20 is usually a death event, but it's this 10 years before where we're seeing this exploitability, the inability to assess risk, the inability to tell the difference between the truth and a lie, and that lack of intuition that Tony, you're talking about. You know, it's like that intuition seems to be suppressed in this 10 years before we see an incapacity in the brain.
Well, if I can chime in here, you know, from my perspective, once somebody's declared legally incapacitated, our cases are easy, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they're very easy, but if you want to put it on a scale, right, the harder cases we get are when you have somebody who's not declared legally incapacitated, but is vulnerable, because that person may be going down that road already, right? And they may forget certain things, right? Which means that you have prior recorded statements that later on in court I can't use, or maybe I can, I don't know, right? So I know that you know, at some point, you know, what can just broadly, what can we do to make our, you know, to prosecute these cases a little better? Well, how about that? You know, I have a case right now where we have someone who's deteriorating, and we don't know if she's going to make it by the time that there's an arrest and we get to court.
Yeah.
So if she's still alive, but she can't say that individual is the one, I never gave that individual any permission to do X, Y, and Z in court, then I lose the case. So I can try to refresh her recollection, et cetera. But if there's a legislative fix for, say, I don't know, allowing a pre-recorded statement in, right? If there's a legislative fix for, you know, allowing extraneous evidence of a victim's statement, that would be greatly, that would be helpful. Now, there are ways we can get it in, but if there was especially if there was limited to, if there was a reform with the rules of evidence legislatively that could happen, that would be really helpful. And you'd have to limit that only to, say, elder exploitation cases.
Because
you can't open the
Tony,
floodgates.
we passed that in 2012. We actually had a hearsay exception that, statutorily still. But there was a case that overruled that because of the confrontation clause.
Right.
We did legislate it.
I know you did it. And that's what's frustrating, right? Because say I come from a jurisdiction where you can have somebody in court adopt their prior statement in court by reading it to them, right? Can't do that here.
Well, let me just add one more thing to this list for people. And I know I want everyone to know I have no interest in this company. I love them tremendously, but there is an app. It's called the Careful app, CAREFULL. And I know we just did a webinar with them. They are amazing. They provide monitoring of accounts. It doesn't take over ownership, but for example, you have a trusted contact on the app that gets a notification if you pay a bill twice or forget to pay a bill. They establish an algorithm so that they can see when you're in a romance scam. They send notifications for, you know, various things when you fall outside that regular algorithm of your payments, and they've been really great. It can be a resource in particular for people who don't really have family members that are close by, kind of keeping an eye on them. The other thing that I would add, we do in Florida have something called a pre-need consent against exploitation, where people can say in advance that they'd like certain trusted contacts to be able to freeze their assets down by going into court and getting this exploitation injunction. So the pre-need consent against exploitation is another way that we can plan in advance. And I will tell you guys, like, we in the elder law section, like, I have so many clients coming in, and when we developed that particular pre-need consent against exploitation, I thought for sure it would be like 1 in 5 people that wanted that. But you all know, every single client that I have that comes in and I say, look, do you want to say in advance that if you start to get scammed, that you're willing to have these trusted people freeze your assets down with court approval? They always say yes. I've not had a single person come in and say no, because they have all seen someone lose everything to a scammer. You know, the average number of times someone gets scammed 7 times before they're out of money or before a guardianship gets established. So it's crazy out there. Okay. State Attorney Rendell, I want to come back to you. You've done some great work out there in prosecuting these cases. Tell us what you see in the future. What are you seeing? You know, are there new tools coming across your radar? Are there things that we can do legislatively to help you do your job better?
So I think as I'm listening to everyone, right, we've got some good tools. We need more tools. Some of the things that Tony mentioned, they sound like weeds, but those of us who are lawyers, we get, and so does the deputy sheriff get that. Those are the requirements you need. I'm thinking that one of the things I'm trying to do a better job of, and I think we all need to, and that is education, awareness. And so I've even learned some things listening right today and listening to you, what's available, and just imagine what it's like. So one of the things we are doing, and we're going to be increasing this, especially this is Elderly Law Month, I think it is. We have an Elderly Law Day, is we're going to hook up with all of our caretakers. So these medical clinics, we're not even talking about Medicaid. We haven't even talked about that part of it, right? Where they're utilized to commit frauds. But with all of our medical providers, and start to do, and homeowners associations, many of our elderly live in condominiums. Our homeowners association also, they just exploit some of these elderly. The elderly say, I thought I paid my fees, my quarterly fees. And they say, no, you didn't. And they take the house away, things like that. But is to do awareness, because it's not just family. We got to do family, but it's the people that pick them up in vehicles. It's the case managers when they show up at the medical clinic. It's the doctors, what to look for. It's like somebody mentioned the neighbors. We had a terrible case where the daughter had her mother Baker acted. All right. And the mother was Baker acted so she could take over the house.
Lovely.
When she ended up at the facility for the mentally challenged, she convinced them, I'm not insane. My daughter's doing this. So she went back to the house, and sure enough, they went to another facility and had her Baker acted. Oh, how did we find this going on? A neighbor saw her shoe because they dragged her out of the house. Anyway, it's everybody. The more people that we can educate, right? The medical professionals, law enforcement working with us, the private bar. I mean, you guys can do a marvelous, it's such a service of opportunities that you're talking about that many people don't know, including us to some extent, right? So I think that's going to be the big challenge for us, is to get the word out, educate, go to all these, go where they are, and help them help themselves.
I love that. And I think education is the key. It's just like one of the reasons that we set this up today is that we need to have these kinds of conversations and do this level of education. Sergeant Lewis, anything you want to add, like any suggestions? I want to tell you guys about this tool that I learned about in the last couple of weeks, where there was a local law enforcement, like I forget which county it is. Maybe you all have heard of this, where they actually have an in-house IT person that when a victim gets malware on their computer, so someone has taken over their computer, and we know that that's one of the ways that we're seeing scammers access, that local law enforcement will send out their IT guy to get the malware removed from the computer. And I was like, oh my gosh, what an amazing tool for law enforcement. Of course, we need to make sure that that doesn't keep happening. But I mean, at least it's something where we're actually, you can trust this person, this IT person coming in because they're from local law enforcement and they're doing this beautiful thing about removing this terrible scammer from somebody's computer who can literally drain bank accounts. That was one tool that I learned about that was unique. Sergeant Lewis, do you have anything to add on that, or do you know anything cool that's going on out there similarly?
I haven't heard anything about that, but we just try to we honestly try to get through social media and we go through HOAs and we try to educate in firsthand knowledge, because with the elderly population, we also know that social media isn't the best information to pass on. They, firsthand knowledge and in-person meetings we try to do a lot of times of. And that's where we see that. And I've even taught a class where in our Citizens Academy where I said to explaining an exploitation over the phone and, grandparent scheme. And one of the ladies came up to me and said, I heard about this, and then it happened to me a week later. And I didn't realize it was happening to me. And she goes, and then you say it to me. And I said, these people are good. They're trained. They're just like how a cop is trained in an FTO program, field training officer. These guys get trained in wherever country they are to swindle you out of money. I mean, most people saw the movie, The Beekeeper, and how they go through it. And, I kind of wish that was in the United States, a lot of those call centers, because I'd love to go visit them and do what Tatham gets to do. But unfortunately, we live in the United States. But those things happen, and we try to get out and see these people as much as we can, and we have our own units that go out and talk to their homeowners associations. They have town halls, because I think the message to get them out and to tell them it needs to be in person, because when they see it on social media, it's not like it's a different generation of information, and that's not their way of obtaining information. So I think we try to do it that way. News articles,
Yeah,
we do it through social media, but we do a lot through trying to get in touch with them in person. And my detectives, the first thing they do is they go out and talk to the person that's victimized of an exploitation. That's one of the first things they do, because again, like the state attorneys have said, they need to get that information. They need to get that statement as fast as possible, and they need
right.
to get that information and track it down. On
Yeah.
other financial stuff, we try to wait till we have account records, but we want to have that firsthand knowledge from the exploitation victim.
And I think just like you guys are talking about, what State Attorney Rundle is talking about with, like, there has to be collaboration, because as we know, that victim doesn't just have this happen one time. Like, we have to have the family come in. We need to sometimes set up guardianship. Sometimes there are other protective measures, like we talked about trust-based planning. I can tell you guys, as an estate planning attorney, we now have our trust crafted so that we use something called Ulysses clauses. So if our grantor of the trust starts to be exploited, we actually have a provision in the trust itself that then moves the gatekeepers of the trust into the successor trustees. Sometimes we create a provision that says if there's assets going out of the trust that exceed a certain amount, like $10,000, then you have to have this third party review the transaction. I mean, there's techniques that we can use in trust-based planning that don't necessarily remove control from the grantor, but instead create protection levels. And we've been really successful in doing some estate planning like that. And people love it. They don't want to be scammed. They also love their independence. They don't want somebody putting them in a nursing home because they got scammed. So sometimes they don't report because they're worried that they're going to have all their rights taken away or be in a guardianship. And, we've got to get better with creating tools to honor people's abilities, but also protect them. And I think it's really challenging. And I think it's like you guys have all been saying, it's like threading a needle. I mean, I hear Tony talking about, we have victims. I can tell you, Tony, I've had victims in these exploitation cases, and their depositions being taken, and they are totally saying something different than what they said 2 weeks before. And you're like, oh no, Mrs. Jones, remember? Like, so it is hard because their brains are changing. They're going through these changes in their brains, and it is very hard. But I will also tell you, and it's interesting that you guys are talking about these cases, we see death events from exploitation. People are like, oh no, it's just that their finances are removed. No, it kills people because they're so embarrassed that it happened to them. They don't have money to live the way they did their whole lives. And now they are just having to go through all this litigation, and they're having to go to court and talk to lawyers. And it literally is so stressful on them going through the process that so many times we see death events, and it's killing our people, and we've got to do better. So you guys are in the trenches through this stuff. I know we're at the end of our time. I just want to give everybody an opportunity to make any closing remarks. I just so enjoyed this with all of you. So please take a minute to tell us, give us a little summary or what you hope for the future, that sort of thing. It's State Attorney.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for letting me go first. I just want to thank the bar. Like I started out, because as I'm listening to everybody, I'm really sensing that there's a wonderful opportunity here for enhanced collaborating. We already do to some extent, but the problem is so big, it's so complicated, has so many tentacles, and there's so many of us that care that if we just all got our energies and our resources and our brains together, we can make a dent in this really terrible area. And I think it's only going to get worse as our populations grow, not just in terms of number, but in terms of aging as well. And I'm really excited about this. I learned some things today. I hope some of the listeners that you pulled together today did also. And thank you, Shannon, for what you and your whole section does. And we'll be knocking on your door for sure.
Okay, come on. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Sergeant Lewis?
I think, if we can, all work together, as like we said, you guys have a task force over there, and it seems like it's working great. We work directly with our state attorney's office here in the 20th Judicial Circuit, and it makes it a cohesive unit where if, hey, look, the attorney sees an issue with the case, and we're going to try to close that gap. We're going to try to get that taken care of, because we care about our victims here, and I'm sure you guys, everyone here does. We just want to make sure that, everyone, especially the elderly, because they can't take care of themselves as much as everyone else. And we really try to make sure that we go out and we do the best we can for them, because they are vulnerable. And I love that Eva mentality of, the vulnerable adults. I think it's something that, everyone needs to in the state of Florida, take a part in.
By the way, is Amira Fox your state attorney?
Yes, ma'am.
She's awesome. That's great. You got a great state attorney over there.
That team, our team of state attorneys, like I said, I worked with JD Miller and Jessica Horowitz over there. I've prosecuted cases with them, and we work so well together. The communication's flawless.
It's excellent. Give them my regards.
I will. Thank you.
Tony, you have any final words for us?
Just that, number one, we're a prosecuting agency, and while we work very well with police, I think the first line of defense is reporting it to police. So, to follow up on what Sergeant Lewis said, they're doing an investigation, and we're evaluating the investigation. Working together, it helps. It helps when you work together and you come to a conclusion jointly. But ultimately, I don't have a badge, right? I don't have a badge that says detective. So what I always advise everyone is that if you do have something to report, go ahead and report it to your local jurisdiction first. But you can always feel free to report it to your local state attorney. I saw that there was a question in the chat about whether we had a hotline for people to report crimes of exploitations, and we do.
We do.
And I went ahead and I answered it in the chat, but I'll say it here for everybody's benefit. Our hotline is telephone number 786-804-6723. And while I give you the caveat that I'm not an investigator and I don't have a badge that says detective, if we do get a case, we often refer it to the appropriate investigator. So it's very important to report it, whether it's us, your local police department, to Adult Protective Services, or go get a lawyer, right? Who then will report it to us. But the point is, speak up.
Or all of the above, right, Tony?
Right.
There you go.
Let me put one more thing on everybody's radar. The elder law section is working on legislation for the next legislative session called substitute service. And in this particular legislation, which is geared towards exploiters that cannot be identifiable, so the scammers, the people out there who are pretending to be someone who they're not, What we found in the exploitation world is that it's very difficult to get jurisdiction over someone who you can't identify or serve personally. So this new legislation that we're proposing this legislative session will allow us to provide service by using the same method that they're communicating with our victim. So if it's on Millionaire Match, or it's through Telegram, or it's through WhatsApp,